Hey, I'm Golden JR, and a while back I made a video talking about José Carioca and why Disney made him. But now I want to talk about what happened after the original movies, and how over the decades the character evolved in animation, but also how in Brazil he became a very different character thanks to him having his own comic book series that were on for decades and only ended in 2018 on, believe it or not, issue 2446. But before we start, there is something I forgot to talk about in the first video, because I honestly didn't know. Saludos, Amigos and the Three Caballeros was supposed to be a trilogy. Cuba and Carnival was supposed to be released in theaters in 1946. But since the war was over, there weren't many reasons to make another movie for the good neighborhood policy, so it was cancelled. Even though the movie was cancelled, a music segment was recycled and became Blame to the Samba in Melody Time. But now, let's focus on these two concept arts. José was supposed to have a love interest, while this ended up not happening on the big screen. José already had a girlfriend on the newspaper strips, and it was on the pages, not on the movies, that José became a character loved by Brazilians. In the United States, Disney had a series of comic strips on newspaper called Silly Symphony that was used to promote that series of theatrical shorts of the same name. José was the star of the series from 1942 to 1944 to promote Saludos, amigos. In the comics, José was a very poor man that tricks people to get what he wants. In the first story, he eats in an expensive restaurant and convinces the waiter that an old man that just had left stole his wallet. The following stories are about him meeting a girl called Rosita Vaz, later renamed to Rosinha Vaz when the comics came to Brazil, since Rosita is a Hispanic name, not a Brazilian one. And also, he met her father, Rocha Vaz, who is the owner of a bank. José then started lying to the rich family about being rich himself to get what he wants from them. And that's it. He just lies and tries to cover his lies by lying even more. José also tries to date multiple women at once. Honestly, I hate this version of the character. It's pretty much the opposite of who he was in Saludos, Amigos. It is so odd considering that his first comic, released before the movie, was in theaters in the United States. In fact, Panchito also shows up at the end of the comic run, months before the release of the Three Caballeros, probably to promote that movie as well. It is so weird to see him hating José. In this story, both of them like the same girl and started competing for her, and José keeps cheating. This version of José is so unlikable. No wonder after his introduction, Panchito became the main character of the Silly Symphony comics. But thankfully it was popular enough in Brazil to give him a second chance in a new comic book series. Okay, now the story gets a little confusing. The newspaper comic strip were released in Brazil in the late 40s and early 50s by the publisher Globo. At the time they had a variety series of comic books where they put a lot of short stories together from series they had the license. So José Carioca and Superman technically were in the same comic book. After the original comic strip ended, another publisher, called Abril, got the license to release Disney Comics in Brazil. Donald Duck got his own weekly series in 1950. And look who is in the cover of Donald's first book. Despite being right there in the cover, José is not in any story. In fact, Joe Carioca is in the cover of the majority of Donald's early comics. But he only shows up on issues 8, 15, 23 and 27. All of those stories were just translation of comics from the US and Europe. Abril did not make comics at the time, they were just the publisher. After the movies, José Carioca disappeared from the US, but Brazilians wanted to see him again. And unfortunately, there weren't new materials to translate, so they started making their own. That's right, stories made by the people José was supposed to represent. But early on, they were in fact made in Argentina. Yeah, the artists behind the early issues of José's comic made for Brazilian readers were from Argentina. Anyway, the first story, made for Brazil but not by Brazilians, was the return of Zé Carioca, and as you can see, it was around that time that they decided to officially call him Zé Carioca, instead of José Carioca. Zé is just a shortened version of José, and the same could be said to Joe. It doesn't matter. In this story, Zé has returned to Rio after years in Hollywood and decided to open a store selling musical instruments. But another store owner gets mad that Zé is stealing his clients from him. So he decides to sabotage Zé's instruments, and of course, Zé does the same to him. That is a good Zé Carioca. This version of the character is a fusion from what we have seen in the movies and the one from the newspaper comic strips. The story starts with him hiding on top of an airplane because he doesn't want to pay for the travel, and he is chased by the workers at the airport. But after opening his own store, he only starts scheming against the other store owner after he sabotages Zé's musical instruments. This Zé still has the edge from the newspaper strips without being an unlikable villain. He doesn't pay for his airplane travel, but who cares, it's a big company, it's not like it would make a difference. And he only schemes against the store owner after it has already happened to him. I can see this Zé befriending Donald and Panchito, but I can't say the same about the version from the older newspaper strips. So, when did José Carioca start having his own solo comic series? Good question. How do I start explaining this? Okay, like I said, Donald Duck had a weekly comic book series in Brazil that started in 1950. Zé was on the cover of a lot of books early on, but he only showed up on issues 18, 15, 23 and 27. After that, Zé's next appearance was on issue 165, where we had the story about him returning to Brazil that I mentioned earlier. Finally, in 1961, we got O Pato Donald apresenta Zé Carioca, or Donald Duck presents Joe Carioca. This was Donald Duck, issue 479, and also Zé's first solo comic book. From that point onward, Donald only had comics every 2 weeks, because in the weeks without Donald, we had Zé's comics. But the thing is, they kept sharing the issue number, so after Zé's first comic, issue 479, we got Donald Duck 480, and next week Zé Carioca 481. This mess only ended in 1985, when they finally decided that both comics should stop sharing the same issue number, but they didn't reset the number. So despite that Zé's last comic was issue 2446, he did not have that many books. But having one book at minimum every 2 weeks from 1961 to 2018 is still very impressive. It took a while for Zé Carioca's comic to stand on its own. Early on, Zé had very short stories, and the rest of the book was filled with translated comics from other Disney characters like Mickey or Goofy. During the 60s, a lot of Zé's stories were actually recycled from Mickey and Donald comics, so his personality changed a lot until Abril had a team just to make Zé Carioca's comics. By the middle of the 70s, Zé already had a defined personality and side characters to call his own. And surprisingly, there was a lot of inspiration from the original newspaper strips. So let's meet the Brazilian José Carioca. He lives in Churupita village, a fictitious neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro. He is a very lazy man that has no job and never wakes up before noon. He usually never says no to food and always tries to get it for free. Zé always tries new schemes to get money with the least amount of effort possible. It usually backfires and the people he tricks get their money back. He has a best friend called Nestor who, fun fact, was a minor character in the newspaper strips. Nestor is as poor as Zé and always gets involved in his schemes even when he doesn't want to. Nestor is usually the conscience that avoids Zé going too far, but if he thinks that Zé has a really good plan, he will do it. Besides Nestor, José is also friends with Pedrão, who sometimes is the victim of Zé's plan. That's what happens when you know José Carioca and have a job. Pedrão also has a... wait... Jaca in English is called jackfruit? Really? I'm sorry, that is a horrible name for the fruit. I will keep calling jaca. Anyway, Pedrão has a jaca tree in his backyard and sometimes Zé and Nestor tries to steal his fruits. Pedrão also had, let's say, weird design in the 70s that thankfully was changed in the 80s. Zé has a girlfriend called Rosinha. She is the daughter of the rich man called Rocha Vaz. Unlike the newspaper Rosinha, comic Rosinha knows very well who her boyfriend is, and is not easily tricked by him. Zé usually doesn't ask her for money, but she is the one paying when they go out on a date. Rocha Vaz, however, is not as friendly. He hates his son-in-law, seeing him as a person that just wants his money. Rocha does everything to keep Zé away from Rosinha. Quite the opposite of the newspaper strips, where Rocha Vaz was very easily tricked by Joe Carioca. Speaking of the newspaper, Rosinha had a fiancé, a very rich man that hadn't any personality besides being rich. The comics decided to give Zé another rival, Zé Galo. Yes, both share the same first name. Zé Galo is Rocha Vaz's favorite and wishes that Rosinha give him a chance, but she doesn't care about him. Zé Galo also loves to be on Rocha Vaz's good side and seems to care a lot about his money. That is something that Zé Galo and the newspaper strip version of José Carioca have in common. I wonder if it was intentional. So why don't we give a look at two stories from the comic series? Both of them are from the issue 1747, released in 1985. The book starts with Zé and Nestor looking at people fighting in front of the newsstands. They quickly learned that everybody wanted the new magazine with pictures of Michael Jackson in it, or actually a parody of him. I'm not going to localize the pun. Anyway, Zé has an idea for a scheme, and somehow Nestor teleports to the arm of Christ of the Redeemer. After Zé convinces Nestor that he will be able to see a Michael Jackson concert, Zé starts preparing said concert, even without the main singer, until he reveals to Nestor that he will be the one on stage. So, Nestor does exactly that and nobody buys it. And when they realize that Michael Jackson isn't there, Zé and Nestor ended up in a hospital. The other story is about Rosinha and her father, Rocha Vaz, in one of their many farms. Rosinha hears a howl and Rocha Vaz reveals that the place is haunted. Rosinha doesn't believe it and calls Zé to investigate, and he brings Nestor with him, because of course he does. The both of them hide because Rocha Vaz hates them. They quickly find a ghost of a dog and a ghost of a man or a bird that chase them. After seeing Zé and Nestor running for their lives, Rocha Vaz charge after them, thinking they are the ones haunting the place. Rosinha quickly shows up, revealing to her father that she called them for help with the problem. They follow the footprints of the dog to an old barn, where they are cornered by the ghosts. Rocha Vaz immediately realizes that they are just covered in blue paint, and the guy reveals that his family was the previous owner of the property and that they want it back no matter what. Thinking he can use this as an opportunity to finally win the trust of his father-in-law, Zé tries to distract the dog. Rosinha sees that as an opportunity to remove the gun from the hands of the blue guy, and with the help of Nestor, they capture him. The story jumps 2 days later, where Zé says to Nestor that he will enter the Rocha Vaz mansion by the front door because Rocha Vaz must like him now. But in reality, after the blue guy was arrested, Rocha Vaz kept the dog and trained it to chase intruders, especially José Carioca. As you can see, in the same book, we have different sides of José Carioca, the con artist and the lazy but helpful friend. Try to balance the two sides of the character isn't easy, because he can end up being very unlikable, like in the 40s newspaper strips, or just another of Disney's boring protagonists. And specifically for comic books, we already have Mickey. I guess the trick is to show Zé losing when he plans something really bad. And if he's helping someone, it needs to be shown that he always thinks of what he can get from helping, even when he truly wants to help. The comics ran for a long time, so it's not surprising to see that the characters changed a lot before we got the status quo. But something else changed over the years. Their designs. Rosinha's design changed a lot, but so did Minnie and Daisy's, so no surprises here. Nestor is the one that took the longest to get the modern design. He looked way different in the newspaper strip, and his design wasn't consistent until the late 70s. And the less we talk about Pedrão's early days, the better. But surprisingly, José Carioca also had redesigns. Unfortunately, it was in the 90s. Yeah, I hate this look, and I really don't need to explain why. Nestor also got a redesign, and they changed the hat? Why? It was the only consistent part of his design, being there since the 40s. Sorry, but I really don't like Zé's redesign. Why is he using a hat backwards? Why did they give him pants? The blue feathers on his leg already were supposed to look like pants, so why did they give him blue pants? Anyway, everybody else looked fine. Wait, did I just say that Zé has blue feathers? Did he always have blue feathers? No, he didn't. There was a detail in the comic books. In fact, he always had blue feathers on his legs during the newspaper strips, but he never had them on the movies. That's not the only difference in his design, because when he's made by Brazilians, Zé has blue eyes. But everything had to come to an end. And after 57 years of comics, Abril stopped making and publishing Disney comics, mainly because of something called bankruptcy. Disney, however, partnered with another publisher, Culturama, to bring the characters back to the pages. but this time Zé would not have his own series, appearing on general Disney comics, but he gets the spotlight from time to time. Although I never read one of the Culturama comics, I must say I really like the design for José Carioca, and he still has the blue feathers on his leg and blue eyes. The characters created by Abril are also in the comics, so it's nice to see that their legacy is still alive somewhat. That's about it for Zé Comics, because it's time to see what Disney is doing with him on TV, and... oh god. Yeah, after Two Happy Amigos and Carnival Time in 1961, his next appearance in animation was in 1999 on Mickey Mouse Works, and later on House of Mouse. Starting with Mickey Mouse Works, he appeared in one short, and it's the first time his name is pronounced wrong for a whole cartoon. Minnie asked José to make a fancy dinner for her and Mickey, and he made her a sandwich. That's it. José only has 3 scenes in this 60-minute short, so there isn't much to say. This was the first time José was not voiced by a Brazilian, but I can't say if he does a good Brazilian accent or not. I'm not a native English speaker, so I'm not good with accents. So, you tell me.
Signorina Minnie, I will make for you the most romantic Brazilian feast.
But he does say some words in Portuguese, and it's actually spot on, at least in the first scene, because there is a problem at the end. It's not actually the pronunciation, but the word he's using is from European Portuguese, to the point that I had to look up what the word fiambre means.
Este o queijo, o fiambre, o queijo, tomate, o fiambre, tomate e queijo sandwich.
It's the word for ham in Portugal. In Brazil, the word is presunto. I don't have much to say about this very short cartoon, so let's jump to House of Mouse. Oh boy, that's worse. Song aside, the voice is really bad.
Rodente, don't you worry, huh? We've got a song for him.
Even I can tell this. So, yeah, the voice is really bad. It's that hard to know how a Brazilian accent sounds like. Everything about the 3 Caballeros in this episode is about Mexico. That's the majority of José's one-off appearance, so... and I really don't want to talk about them, so let's jump to Legend of the 3 Caballeros, where he is one of the main characters. The show is not available in Brazil. That's not a good sign. But that won't stop me, of course. Legend of the 3 Caballeros is a 12-episode series on Disney+, where Donald Duck, José Carioca, and Panchito go to adventure worldwide with the help of Sandra, god of adventure. Together they must stop a evil wizard, just like their ancestor did. The show is enjoyable, the animation was a hit or miss, and in general the show feels like a worse DuckTales 2017, but it's fine for what it is. José was voiced by Eric Bauza, the voice of Bugs Bunny, and he did a good job, but he pronounced José's name wrong, just like everybody else in the show.
Judging by your ensemble, you hail from Greece?
Yeah?
Allow me to introduce myself. I am José Carioca, and you, my goddess, are a vision. Or as the Greeks say, Maritsi Santirifeta.
I smell like feta cheese?
Since José is one of the 3 main characters, I was hoping that they would get it right this time, but I know that as long as there isn't a single Brazilian in the production, this is going to happen. So, who is this version of José Carioca? He's the brain of the trio, or at least the voice of reason. During the show, José speaks the language, or at least he tries to, but I noticed that he never speaks Portuguese, not even once. In fact, he never even mentions Brazil. Panchito uses Spanish words all the time. There is a whole episode in Mexico. Even though the plot of the show is about them going on adventures in different parts of the world, they don't go to Brazil. It's almost as if the writers didn't know a thing about Brazil. I'm not saying that was what happened, but it's very odd that despite José being one of the 3 main characters, he's the only one without a spotlight episode. Panchito is the brawn of the group and usually speaks the first thing in his mind. And Donald, well, it's Donald. So José is just the normal guy. This is not a bad version of the character, but if they had borrowed a little bit of the comics, and I'm not even talking about the Brazilians one, he could have been a more interesting character in the show. Also, Araquan is a character in the show, and he's technically Brazilian. He does exactly what you expect for him after watching the movies. But for some reason, he's called Ari in this show. I believe they only call him the Araquan bird, only once. Well, not the only thing left to talk about is the version of José Carioca from DuckTales 2017. And it's quite good. For the first time since 1961, he was voiced by a Brazilian, but that doesn't mean his name was pronounced correctly. But the interesting part is that José never says his own name.
Surely you remember old Panchito and Jose!
Os patinhos! Oh, last time we saw you, you were just little eggs!
Anyway, in this episode, the Duck family are visiting Brazil and Donald lies to José and Panchito, saying that Scrooge retired and that he was now a billionaire. and owner of the MacDuck Industries. In the end, José Carioca and Panchito were also lying about being successful. I like how this is something that I could have easily seen the comic book version of José Carioca doing. Not that I think that the writers knew anything about his comic book history in Brazil. Now that he was finally voiced by a Brazilian, I don't need to talk about his accent, but there is another character that speaks a word in Portuguese in this episode, and that's Webby. At one point she says that her Portuguese is worsty, and she does that by saying the Portuguese word for worsty, enferrujado, but guess what? She pronounced the J like it was an H. Not that I think it's a problem that Webby messed up a single word. José appeared in more episodes, but he doesn't have any major roles in it, so there isn't more to say about DuckTales. Yeah, that's it. That was the last major appearance of José Carioca in animation. What a sad story, to be honest. He's now just a cameo, or one-off appearance, and even when he was one of the main characters of a show, they didn't know what to do with him. After all, we cannot have Brazilian reference if writers have no idea what makes Brazil unique, and since the majority of the actors were not Brazilian, they cannot even improvise. That's it for the video. I don't have a conclusion besides saying that I wish José, Joe, or even better, Zé Carioca could be used better. Brazil has so many great and creative artists. We saw a lot of their work here thanks to the comics. I want a Zé Carioca TV show made by Brazilians, one based on comics where Zé is a lazy con artist that still have a good heart. A way that we could see an animated version of Nestor and Rosinha, one where he has nephews and is hated by his father-in-law. But I also wish that they would not forget his original concept. My ideal Zé would also be a musician, something that the comics usually ignore since, you know, there's no sound. And at the end of the day, I just don't want another Zé that's just Donald's Brazilian friend and nothing else, or even worse, not even Brazilian, just Donald's friend. I want a story that finally shows to the world who Zé Carioca is for Brazil. And see you next time. I don't know what will happen next time, but see you there.